Right.
So if you're listening on Zoom, could you make sure you're muted, please? Otherwise we all hear you.
Oh, there you go.
And also, if you are watching or listening on Zoom, it would be really interesting for us to have some feedback on whether you can see us and hear it, etc. from home.
Yeah.
But, last, thank you very much, Sheila.
Okay,
Would you like
off we go. Yes, please.
Sorry, guys. We find something new to do wrong every single time we start.
Here we go.
You are doing it, aren't you?
Street end. Right, just in case everybody isn't quite sure where Street End is, and we're not just talking about a little bit of road that runs from the Bath Road up the hill. Mostly of that, I am not actually going to be talking about some of the newer builds. I'm actually focusing on the older houses further up the hill. And those are the sort of areas we're going to look at, but not necessarily strictly in that order. Okay. So these are the sources, and also I've been able to look at people's deeds, which has been really helpful because that really gives you the proper story of what's happened to various families. So it's quite a large amount of information we've had the chance to look at. This is just reminding people just how small the houses were in these days. That street end lane, if those of you might remember, that was Sybil Lindsay's cottage, Alexandra Cottage at the end there, and Glenview. And you can see Glenview was actually 2 cottages, and the inset there is Glenview today. They were very small. There's what's interesting is the lack of foliage in there as well. I mean, it's now you can't see most of that because of trees and shrubs. So this is the area. This is the tithe map, which is from 1842. This was a complete survey of the village of every house and outbuilding, and it recorded the owners and occupiers. And it's a really valuable document to try and see who was living where. The census is all very well, but it doesn't tell you who's an owner, it only shows you occupiers. The hill gardens here were a really important part of people's lives for growing food for the winter, particularly potatoes, greens, and so on. And children were often absent for school. The school log recalls quite often children were absent from school picking potatoes or planting potatoes or in the apple harvest. So let's move on. And here's another piece of ground that was used for allotments. This is the big stretch of land from the A368 going up the hill. And that was actually sold to a builder, Frank Puddy, in 1933. And the piece of ground next to it was sold when the bakery closed in 1959. So you can see that big tranche of land was available for development after the later 1930s and beyond. And this is a little view of Rodian before the development. That's the Forge and Forge Cottage on the left, and Roddy Cottage on the end of Lantern Cottage on the right. Yew Tree straight ahead of you, and you can see there's no bungalows there. That was before the bungalows were built. This is the top of the hill. That little metal fence you can see here, my cursor showing that it's not. That has actually just been uncovered when they've been clearing away some of those ash saplings and the brambles and things. That little metal fence on the right there is now visible again. And you can see the unmade roads. It looks like people are walking down to church or something. And Channel View, which was built in 1908. It's not one of the older houses. And unmade roads, bit of ditches at the end. It looks quite slippery, doesn't it, with gravel and things on it. And you can see the newly built dam and the road over the dam in the distance. And a lovely orchard on the right there. And there were so many orchards in Blagdon at one time.
Yep.
Right, so let's go on to talk about the Vestry. The Vestry were effectively the ruling body of the village who organised everything. And as you can see that at the bottom paragraph, those were all their responsibilities. And in addition to that, they also had to control vermin. They used to pay people for bringing in sparrows and badgers' heads and all sorts of things. In fact, there's been some interesting articles about the decimation of the sparrow population due to the payments they made for, so say vermin. And what we're going to look at is just who owned all these cottages with the blue dots on. The tithe apportionment in 1842 lists all of those houses with the blue dots as being owned by the overseers of the poor. And there's out of the 16 houses listed, 14 of them were in Street End. And you probably won't recognise where half of those places are at the moment, but 6, 7, 8 is Dingle Cottage. 6, 7, 4 on the left-hand side is Brayside. And over here on the right, 6, 4, 7 is Wayside. But it'll be clearer in a moment when we look at some more maps. And this is another picture of Street End in the early days. We've got Dingle Cottage in front of us, Wayside on the right bottom, and in the centre is Rock Cottage, which you can see at the moment is just at inset on the left. Certain expansion, there's a tiny little bit of that. You can just about see that top window next to the tree in the inset. Yeah. And that's what remains of the original cottage. Quite astonishing how things have changed, really. Yes. And of course, the Street End Lane itself is quite narrow, but wide, maybe, I don't know. Oops, sorry, I've gone up again. Right. Now, this is from the Vestry minutes, because there were some goings on in 1821 that really upset the Vestry. They'd had a report in January to say that all of these people had built cottages on this stone gravel pits, which was parish land. And I don't quite know why they hadn't noticed them being built as it went along, but anyway. But maybe they never went near the stone gravel pits, I don't know. And it's interesting that Jacob Derrick and William Derrick, their names were crossed out. So it appears that their homes were legal. And the top, we've got James Day, the Dabbs, who lived in Street End Cottage, Richard Bush, who was Hillside, John Cannard, James Hewish, who was Rock Cottage, George Lemon and Thomas Lemon were Stony Batch, Isaac Baker, Brayside, and Thomas Derrick, I think, was the Cottage, and John Baker was Wayside. So a fair number of them were called to account. And that's the cottages that were belonging to those people. Now, the Vestry immediately said that they should actually take these cottages down, and they were a nuisance and they shouldn't be there. Yeah. And they also appeared in the press because they were held up at Somerset Quarter Sessions in 1821, and that's a whole different set of names. And this is this philosophy that if you build a house overnight, it's a sundowner cottage and it's yours, which unfortunately wasn't true, because this was parish land. You can't just go along and acquire yourself a piece of parish land and build on it. So what actually happened was they were, first of all, they weren't sentenced at the time. They were given a month in which the idea was they were going to pull these cottages down, and then they wouldn't be charged with anything. But of course, it didn't happen. If they had done that, the Vestry would have had to house them all, and that probably would have been far more complicated and far more expensive. But that's the story that has appeared in these publications. Blagdon on Mendip by Mary Board and Bygone Blagdon, which was published in 1986, both recount this story of getting your walls up to 5 foot, getting the fire built and having a fire by the evening, and then suddenly this is yours. And it's sort of half true in the sense that they built their houses on the stone gravel pits and they didn't have to pull them down, so they did actually manage to get away with it. but it isn't the true sundowner picture, because this is from Mrs. Kettlewell. And she wrote a book called Trinkum Trinkums, which apparently is something to do with trivial matters, or simple things to think about. And she moved into Hartree Court when she married in 1875. And she got to know a lot of the local people while she was there and understood what they were doing. And she wrote this in 1926. And this was her definition or her understanding of what a night house was, or a sundowner cottage. And it was built of turf, which makes a lot more sense if you're trying to build something overnight. Yeah. And actually, it's yours. And it would have been, I suppose, reasonably, sheltered and so on. And there is a story that these were built on the verge, on the way up to Two Trees, when mining was at its peak, which was back in the 17th century. And that makes a lot more sense in terms of a sundowner cottage, rather than people hauling tons of stone and trying to build something in the meantime. But having said that, these cottages, on the stone gravel bits were very small. They certainly weren't anything like they are today. So there's always one, and this is the intrepid Charles Harris. He applied to the Vestry. He obviously had heard what had gone on with the other people, and he applied for permission to build a house, but it was refused. And then the Vestry heard he was actually carrying on building it, and he was asked to take it down, and he took no notice. And he did, in fact, complete it. But he was, this situation seems to have been solved by him paying a shilling for ground rent, an annual. You paid it annually on Lady Day, and it was a permanent acknowledgement that your cottage was built on parish land. And this is it. This is Dingle Cottage. And he started off with a little tiny bit at the end, and it was extended as his family grew. And his sons lived there separately. They all had three, in the census, they're listed as 3 different dwellings. They're not all living in one house together. And the last Harris to be in there actually died in 1961. The part of the cottage was sold in 1951, when one of the people left in the other half of it. And the same person who purchased the first half bought the second bit in 1961. So then it made into one house. So that's not a bad thing for standing up against the Vestry, is it? Homing your family for that amount of time. And occupations, there weren't actually many miners in the area at all. The chief occupation, and this is only the occupations in Street End, was agricultural labour, without a doubt. And later on, in the later years, there was lots of labouring going on in the rest of the village, with all the building work that went on and the construction of the reservoir and so on. There were quite a few masons who lived in the immediate area of the gravel pits. And in 1861, which was the peak of re-smelting the ore up at Charterhouse, then we started to get lead miners back again. And in the village in 1861, there were actually 40 people working in the lead mines. But up here, there was only 6. And rag cutters, which was an occupation that only appeared in 1861, this was cutting up rags, and women did this. And it was cutting up rags for making paper. And then they were pounded into bits. And I think and that probably would have gone to Rickford. But I think they changed the machinery after that. They didn't use that method anymore. And there were 1 or 2 other, there was errand boys and things, but you can see that the majority of the people worked as agricultural labourers. And then there was also this compulsory purchase that went on from the Vestry. They did actually look after the older people reasonably well. I think they knew the parishioners, they knew the ones that worked hard. And if you'd been a mason all your life and you got to your 70s, then it was difficult to carry on working. And also in the winter, when it was the weather was bad, they couldn't work. So they were actually often given relief. There was money available from charities. We were lucky in the village. There were several charities that generated income called second poor money, and people were given relief from that. So it wasn't a question of raising the poor rate and doing other things that would upset people. But this compulsory purchase came along. This is a conveyance. Now, normally conveyances are enormous, but because of this act that simplified the process, it was a one-page document that basically said to the person, under the conditions of this act, you will hand over your house or property to the parish officers, and they will give you some money for it, and you will sign at the bottom, which was about as simple as you could get. And there's quite a few deeds. They actually did it. I mean, especially with older people who weren't able to work anymore, and they sold their houses for £5. Thank you. And here is something in the Vestry minutes. Agreed to, at the top it says, agreed to give James Main the same pay as other old people have as soon as he gives the possession of his house to the parish officers. And there's another one further down, Thomas Derrick, exactly the same. And later on, actually, the families of these people were allowed to acquire these houses back again. So it wasn't a permanent arrangement. So it wasn't, maybe it was something in the Poor Law Amendment Act that said to people, you know, you can't give people out relief if they own property, I don't know. You can see it was a daunting document, and you can see at the top, there's a cross, which was the mark of Jacob Derrick. Now, he obviously couldn't read and write, so to be faced with that document with all these seals along it must have been quite daunting. And they're signed by two guardians who were immediately responsible to the Axbridge workhouse, two church wardens and two overseers. And those are the deeds that actually exist in Somerset Heritage. And all of those people had signed over their houses. So we're going to look at the top of the hill now, just at one area in this particular area, because these houses are sort of linked together loosely. West view. What's on the left is today, and on the right, you can just see the gateway to it in the front, with an earlier picture of Braeside and Channel View in the background. And we know that has to be after 1908, because that was when Channel View was built. Okay. Hold myself a minute. Right. So. So this was one of the cottages owned by the Overseas the Poor, and it was occupied by James and Mary Day. Who were labourers. Their daughter married Richard Filer, and you can see on the front of that cart, if you look closely in the beginning, it actually has his name on it, and that was his road gang. And he and his team looked after a lot of the roads in Blagdon. He, during the construction of the reservoir, the roads were very badly damaged by traction engines and so on, collecting goods from Sanford Station. And he had a contract with the Pethick brothers, who built the lake, and also with Bristol Waterworks later, to look after the roads. And they're still reinforcing the bit that he was allowed to take over the cottages that belonged to his father-in-law, but they're still impressing that it was built on parish land, so they haven't forgiven. So here we are. And then there was this device called the tar pot, which came later. And all those names at the bottom, most of them lived in Street End. Yeah. And this was parked just inside the door on the right, next to the hay barn. That little building, which is now a bit more, used more domestically, had hay in the roof, and below was where they kept the horse. And this vehicle was parked just inside the gate. And the idea was it sprayed tar on the road, and then you spread grit over it, and any bits that you missed with the grit, you put sand over. And Fred Young was actually the descendant of Richard Filer. He actually lived in that cottage for quite a while afterwards as well. So we're already seeing a pattern that people don't move. They stay in there, typically stay for 3 generations in the same house, and still involved in a lot of agricultural work.
Do you know the date of that previous photo?
I think it must be 1920s, because that's when they started tarmacking. Is that right? Does that sound right? It didn't start doing tarmac until the 1920s. So it's got to be after that. I can look it up because I can find out how old Fred Young is. I'll look it up at the end if you like. Find out. Yeah. So Braeside now. You can see on the map, number 674 is a very tiny cottage. It certainly doesn't reach the road. And that's how it was when Isaac Baker built it. And we have a descendant of Isaac Baker with us today, in Anne. Anne is directly related to Isaac Baker. You probably won't think about it at the moment, but she is.
She said you're related to Isaac Baker.
You guys, I believe, great grandfather.
Yes. Yeah. This isn't moving for some reason. Why won't it move? I seem to have frozen.
Sorry?
I seem to have frozen. Yes. No. Oh, here we go. Here we are. Right, there we go. Built by Isaac Baker. He was one of the names on that first slide with the handwriting. So he inherited, his son inherited it, and he was already living in Sladacre Lane, so he didn't want it himself, and he sold it, and it changed hands a couple of times. But during that time, the tenants were George and Eliza Filer, and George was the son of Richard Filer, who we've just seen in Westview next door. The big change came in 1902 when it was sold to Jacob Lyons, and that was lot 4 on that poster. And Jacob Lyons was the one who actually extended it and made it a much bigger cottage. He extended it to make it into 2 cottages, actually. And I think you can see 2 doors quite clearly there. There's a standpipe from when piped water finally came to the village. In turn, we're coming back to the Board sisters. Mary Board, who wrote that booklet, she and her sisters lived in Channel View and Braeside for a number of years. And Jacob Lyons, having extended this cottage, sold it to the Board sisters for £500. They don't seem to have done very much while Eliza and George were there, but they died. George died just after, I don't know when George died actually, before his wife anyway, and she actually in her obituary it said that she lived in that cottage for 66 years. So that was a long tenancy. Tenants seem to be actually quite well protected. They didn't seem to be evicted for reasons and so on. George died in 1907. Right. Oh, I'm going backwards. I am going backwards. Sorry about that. Thought that looked familiar. Right. Okay, and there's the glazed veranda. You can see the different stages in development. And Channel View. Channel View is actually built on the site of a pair of cottages. And it was reputed to be the first holiday home in Blagdon. This is what John Gallop always said. It was a purpose-built rental because the lake and the fishing brought enormous prosperity to the village. It brought tourists who came to see the might of the Victorian engineering in the pumping station and the lovely views. And it also built fishermen, and there was a lack of places to stay. And it was actually purposely built for that reason. But before that came along, it was occupied by the Hollier family and their 9 children. And their married daughter, same sort of thing as Dingle Cottage, lived next door. Here on the right-hand side, there was a lot of misfortune when it caught fire. I think there was a spate of ingle nooks catching fire in the village in about the 70s and 80s, where they suddenly smouldered from the back, and it went on for quite a while anyway. But in this case, it actually took hold, and both cottages fell prey to the flames, as it says. The inmates were obliged to take shelter in the street. By this sad catastrophe, 14 persons have been rendered homeless, and the church wardens were asking for subscriptions to help along the way. And in fact, they must have had some subscriptions because they continued to live in the house. So, and the daughter Selina had even more misfortune because she lost her husband in 1889 when he choked on a piece of tripe, which is a sad way to go, isn't it? There was an inquest in the George Inn, which went into gory detail of what happened to the poor chap. So, not what you want on your grave, is it, really? And there we are, there's an early photograph when it was just not long after it was built. Yeah. Hasn't changed a lot from that sort of angle, really, is it?
That's where I learned to read.
Is it?
Miss Ford's taught me. It's right at the beginning of the war.
Did they? Did you go up to the house then?
I used to walk up to the house, yes.
Oh, okay.
Moved out of Bristol, came to stay with Granny at Blagdon.
All right.
And the Miss Ford's taught me to read.
Yeah, 4 of them were actually teachers.
Yes.
Yes, they were, yeah. Right. And they lived there until 1950. They were the widow and 6 daughters of the man who was MD of Bristol Distilling Company. Only one of the daughters was married. They occupied both houses with a connecting door. And they also bought Homely, which is Quarry Cottage, in 1945. I'm not sure why they did that, but maybe it was just to protect, you know, it was a little group of houses which they had in their ownership. And all 3 were sold to Farley Godwin. And he was a man who came to work for Milliers at Rickford, and then he was taken on as estate manager for Wills. And he had a house built on the other side of the road, which we'll come back to in a minute. Quarry Cottage, also called Homely. This was William Day, and he was the son of James and Mary in Westview. So you can see the closeness of all these village families, they all living together. And William had worked as an agricultural labourer and in the mines as well, and some of his sons worked in the mines. And it was called Homely when Isaac Smart lived here, which was later, but then changed to Quarry Cottage at some point later. And this is Farley Godwin's house, which is on the other side of the road. You can't actually see it very well from the road. You see the drive up to it, don't you? With sort of quite a lot of herbaceous plants around the edge. He had that built in the 1930s, but he obviously decided, you know, he wanted a smaller house, and he bought all 3 houses, and then he immediately sold Channel View afterwards. We can't be at the top of the hill without talking about the Mendip Bungalow Hotel, the scene of many a wedding and a 21st birthday party and things in those days. But the original cottage was 8 rooms upstairs with a corridor down the middle. And it was made of asbestos with a corrugated iron roof. There was a waiting room just inside the door, a lounge and billiard room opening from it, and upstairs was a similar corridor leading to these 8 bedrooms. And it was built by a Mr. Green, and his daughter ran it, Dorothy Green, for a number of years. And then it was bought by John Upton, who ran the fat factory that some of you may remember. It was not popular in the village. There's a waft of foul smells came over. It was on the site of the Mendip wood shavings. And it's often referred to as when the wind blew in a certain direction, we got a dreadful smell from it. But John Upton obviously didn't live on top of it because he actually came down here quite a bit. So, and the Holloways took it over in around 1960, and then it changed completely into something more like the picture on the right. And there was a planning application for a helicopter pad and lots and lots more rooms at one point, but happily it was turned down. So maybe you remember it was actually, it had a very large grant, the College of Further Staff College, which took over the Lodge. The Further Education Staff College took it over in 1985. They were already in Coombe Lodge and they need more space. And they had a very big grant to convert it into a modern suite of conference rooms and seminar rooms and so on. And the O Valley bought it in 1999, and it's now their headquarters. So we're going back down the hill again now to Twincott, which is suddenly declining at the moment. So here we are, 658 in the middle there is Yew Tree Cottage, and right in front of that is Street End Lane going along. 171 is a carpenter's workshop and home, which was there before the forge was built. And you can see behind Yew Tree, there are 2 cottages which are no longer there. They have since been demolished. And here's Twincott, formerly called Little Cottages. And that was, again, on the list of people who'd built houses illegally. The Young family lived there, 2 brothers with their families. And ultimately, it's probably in more recent times, people remember Chris Tidball bought it in about 1920. And it passed through his family to his son, William, actually converted it into 2 cottages, into 1 cottage, sorry. Even in the 60s, there was only a ladder up to the upper floor. There was no staircase and a lean-to for the kitchen. And you can see it's not very big from front to back, is it? But and you can see Mendip Garage just below it. And that's Sidney Winter on the left there. He was, those of you who remember Byron Winter, that was his grandfather.
He was born, Byron was born in that country.
No, he was born in Coombe Dingle, I think.
Oh, I thought he was
Yeah.
born there.
No.
Oh, his grandparents did that, didn't they?
Yes, they did, yeah.
Does anybody live in Twincott now?
I think it's empty, but I don't know what's happening to it because Mark Bates was he inherited it, but did he pass away? I think he did, and I don't know what's happened to it now. It seems to be empty. Here's Yew Tree, formerly a beer house. I think, well, the chap who ran it was George Brunt ran the beer house. Well, I suspect his wife ran the beer house actually because he was a timber merchant. And this whole area actually is quite interesting because it seems to be owned by Joseph Brunt owned it before him, his father. And he seemed to own quite a lot of property in the area. And it's typical again of the way things worked in Street End, because after George left, it was bought by Henry Watts, a butcher, and his wife was a hauler, and so was their widowed sister lived in the little bit on the right hand side. It was 2 separate dwellings, and Mercy Hauler was married to George Monk and lived in the Forge Cottage. So it's another group of 1 family living close to each other. Henry Watts lived in it for quite a number of years. And then eventually after his wife died, it was bought by Arthur Lyons. Arthur and Bella Lyons lived there for a number of years. And in fact, the lady who lives there now is the niece of Bella Lyons. So this is Joseph Brunt. He was the father of George, who ran the beer house, and he owned them. In 1842, he owned Yew Tree and the cottage behind, and he also had land elsewhere in the village. They had 12 children, including twin boys.
Yeah.
So there we are. Quite different there with that little sort of island where that house is now. So we're looking at how people fared in terms of work, and this is settlement records are quite interesting to show where people have worked and just how often they moved. William Council always seemed to be having hard times, really. And he was, the vestry was worried about whether you should stay in the parish, because ultimately, if you had a large family, or if you were ill and couldn't work, you became a burden on the parish. And they held examinations with a JP where you, under oath, described your life and how you'd arrived at the square you were on. And this was one for William Council, which is actually quite useful because it explains how he managed to have the cottage 657. And you can see at the top, he'd built a house on a piece of land given to him by his father-in-law. He'd married Sarah Brunt, who was the daughter of Isaac. And he was supposed to have paid for the land, but he hadn't got the money. And so because his wife looked after Isaac in his declining years, he made him a present. So he ended up owning and occupying that little cottage there. But all was not well, because his daughter Emma married this chap called Robert Barter. And he had also been examined because some of these people just seem to be sinking in misfortune. And this is how they managed to get employment. This is when he was a younger man. In 1829, he hired himself as a servant in husbandry to John Parker. And at the end of the year, you got paid. You had your board and lodging, but you didn't get paid weekly. You had to wait till you completed your time, and then you got the money. And then he did it again for the second year. And then thereafter, he had, a lot of different jobs. He was also chargeable on the said parish of Blagdon through illness for the last 8 years. So he wasn't a well man, he wasn't able to work, and the parish were obviously concerned whether he should be resident here. And his Lady Day was the day when hiring took place, 25th of March, and the rents also were paid on Lady Day quite often. Quite an interesting people to see. You can actually find out where your relatives worked, where they moved to. So she married Robert Barter, and they had 5 children. In 1866, her father had died in Axbridge Workhouse, and her Robert died soon afterwards, and she moved back to the cottage. But all was not well, because unfortunately the cottage was in a pretty bad state, and the inspector of nuisances came along. She had, which was basically, she was in 1880, her daughter, well, slightly later, but in 1871, she had 2 sons aged 29 and 30, and 2 daughters, 16 and 23, all of whom slept in one room. An order was made prohibiting the sons from living in the house. And in September, she was given 1 month to repair the house. Well, she wasn't going to be able to do that. I mean, she didn't have any funds to do it. Her sons, unfortunately, were always being arrested for petty crime, for stealing potatoes or fowls, or being drunk and disorderly. They were in and out of the Axbridge sessions, which were held in Rington or Axbridge. And they were just sort of a family struggling, really. And eventually the house was demolished, and she ended her days in the workhouse in Axbridge, but at 92. So she was not an unwell woman, was she? She was, I think there's something to be said for the water supply in Blagdon, actually. And, I mean, if you were in Bristol, I don't think you would have survived that long, really. So there we are. There's a later map, OS map, and those 2 cottages have gone. So they were obviously not at their best. So now we're going to look at a slightly different thing. This is a sort of legitimate building of a house on grandparents' land. So this is John Derrick, in the tithe. His son Edwin was the tenant, but John was the owner. In fact, the tithe was slightly out of step because John had actually died in 1938. As you can imagine, it took 2 or 3 years for the tithe map and the apportionment to be drawn up. It wasn't an overnight thing. They were actually commissioned to do it in 1934, and I think it took a lot longer than they expected. But John owned those 2 pieces of ground with the star on. And in 1847, Edwin had built a house, a cottage on 637, which is Grove Corner. And he hadn't quite finished it, and he had a growing family. So he needed a mortgage, and he couldn't have a mortgage unless he had proof of ownership. And of course, there was no paperwork because of these casual arrangements. And so he had a declaration under oath by George Lehman of Stony Batch, who was 86 at the time. And he remembered Edwin's father and his grandfather, and he remembered the ground being purchased. And with this sworn declaration in front of a JP, then that was acceptable. And the overseer, Richard Spurlock, also testified that he'd collected the poor rate from Edwin and his mother. And therefore, his ownership was proved. And here is Grove Corner today. Back in those days, it had 4 rooms. He did work as a clerk in the lead mines, and the house was sold in 1867. He went to live in Bristol. He became an innkeeper, and he died not terribly long afterwards, actually. It had a very short life, being called St. Anthony's, which is is that the patron saint of lost things? I don't know, I think it might be. And the old stabling, which had also been owned by Edwin's father, it must have been sold when Edwin moved into the cottage, but it wasn't, we don't know. Surprisingly, the auction in 1871 said it had a bakehouse. And in fact, Thomas Brunt had lived there, and he'd obviously created the bakehouse. He was the grandson of Joseph, who owned Yew Tree. It was actually quite a big house for the time. A lot of the cottages in the area only had between 2 and 4 rooms, so that was actually quite a roomy house. And Thomas Brunt was a baker there for quite a while, and also somebody called Christopher Garraway, who was married to a Brunt. So there's a definite Brunt enclave in this area. And it was tenanted by Frank Haller for a number of years. And there he is in front of the garden. I think Wills bought the cottage in, let me think. It was part of the Wills estate for a while. I got it. Yes, it was bought by Wills in 1906. It had been bought as an investment by William Summers and then by the tailors who ran the shop. They just bought it to rent it out, and that's when Frank Haller was a tenant. And it was sold again in 1964 or 5, and that's when the land was annexed off to build Hunter's End and what's the other one called? Hunter's End and something else. Highbanks, yeah. Highbanks and Hunter's End, which are on Rodian, the 2 bungalows. That was built on the land belonging to this. Frank ran a coal yard. He was a pretty good thatcher. His grandfather had been a thatcher, and I think he must have learnt at an early age. And he was 66 when he was taking part in the competition on the right there. So, and you can see that while it was under the ownership of the Wills family, they put the mock timber on it at the top there, which is typical of village houses built by Wills. I love her sunbonnet. I think it's really nice. Rose Cottage and Rock House were both built by John Clark, the builder from Rickford. He actually was born close in the area. Rock House has a plaque on the front of it saying 1878. Unfortunately, John Clark was bankrupt in 1879, and they had to be sold. They're a very smart building. The Edwards sisters are remembered for living in Rose Cottage, the daughters of George Edwards, who was bailiff for wills. And they lived there for about 40 years. And then the forge, which is another big change that's happening in Street End at the moment. Apparently, Wills bought this land and had the forge and Forge Cottage built for George Monk, who ran the forge for a long time with his brother Edward, who lived in Rose Cottage before the Edward sisters. And when Wills commissioned the building to be carried out, George Monk went down to Little Batch in Grid Lane, and apparently he ran his blacksmiths from there until this work was completed. And Wills went on a cruise on his yacht, and he was horrified when he came back at how close to the road they'd built Forge Cottage. He almost got them to pull it down. He had no intention of it being as close to the road as that. It is a bit crazy, isn't it? But because the forge itself is further back. And it was a blacksmith for a number of years. And then when Arthur Lyons was in and Frank Puddy were in Street End Lane, it was used as a carpenter's workshop and builder's store for a long time. And now it's about to turn into a 2-story house. And that's at the top there is John Gallop, ran Stable Woodcraft from there, did a number of projects. I think they made them a sonic chair for the Rickford, and also the gate for St Hugh's. I think that was made in there. Stony Batch, we couldn't talk about Street End Lane without talking about Tommy Ball. That house was you mentioned the Lemons or Levens, who were also on the list of having their house owned by the overseers. Tommy Ball kept sort of goats and things in that building on the left there on the ground floor. And it stayed in the family for a long time. It was Tommy Ball was actually, his mother died quite young, and he and his sister were sent back to live with their grandparents. His sister married the boy next door, Charles Ernest Adams, and they were both close together. They were actually, both the properties, Grove Cottage next door and this one, were auctioned in 1971, and they almost were demolished. There was an option of buying either property on its own or of demolishing both of them and building one house on the ground. But Stony Batch was sold and the piece of land next to it, so it managed to keep going for a bit longer. And back up the road again to Rodian Puzzle Cottage. They were owned by the stonemasons, William and Jacob, who lived in Lantern Cottage. Very small cottage again now, as you can see. 660 is Rodian Puzzle, and 661 is Lantern Cottage. You can see how small that is on there. And this is the transformation in 1985. You can see the, I don't know if you can see in the roof, but it's not very clear because there's a plank up there as well. But the roof timbers were actually like little saplings, round, completely untreated. You know, it wasn't planks or anything. It was little round saplings, which are still there now, I think. And they've changed the entrance to it now. They swapped it around, and there's a kitchen in the lean-to bed. And this is a receipt for Jacob and William Derrick. They worked on the church rebuilding back in 1921. And this is a receipt for £8, the church wardens, for the sum of £8 for working 4 freestone pillars worked out of the old cross and set at the 2 entrances to the church. So there was a big old cross in the churchyard. There's now only 2 of those pillars there, which are on the west end of the churchyard, because the other ones were removed when they put the lich gate in. But apparently those are still there. And you could see neither of them could write. They've signed with their marks of Jacob and William Derrick at the bottom. And they were both working for Stephen Broad, who was the master mason for the job, and it cost £8. And if you look at the churchyard wall, they were also commissioned to rebuild that in 1821. And if you look at the inside of it, when the ivy's been removed, you can see large pieces of carved masonry from the old church in it, which they've incorporated as they rebuilt it, which is quite nice to see. Rodgate Cottage, this is at the back of Lantern Cottage. You don't see it from the road very easily. And this is another one where he'd built his house on land belonging to his grandfather and his father before him and so on. And then Joseph sold him, when he built the cottage, Joseph sold him the land for £19. And that's again related to the Joseph who was in Yewtree. So here's a picture of the land that he built it on. 669 is the cottage, and if you can see, it's been cut off, the big piece of land, 670, which was owned by Joseph Brunt. Quite a big piece of land, and you know, we're talking about him owning that as well as Yewtree and another property in the village. Lantern Cottage, which we've just said is the very small 661. A similar thing happened. His son Isaac built a cottage on Jacob's land, and he let him have the piece of land and the cottage for £4. In 1846, Isaac wanted to live in Bristol, so he sold the cottage, and he went to live in Bristol, and so James Brunt had both. It all gets a bit mysterious after that, because the cottage gets enormous, and it's very hard to tell how many. If you're trying to match the census to what's going on in this particular bit, it's really difficult because there are so many. It could be 4 families in Rodgate. In Lantern Cottage, you can't really tell. This is Sarah Lyons outside the Rodgate stores. Right. It was actually James Brunt who started the shop in there, and he's also reputed to have started a shirt factory, which we'll come back to in a minute. His daughter Jane married George Tidball, a local man, and the shop was run by the Tidballs for a little bit before passing to Sarah. Sarah married, she was Sarah Tidball, she married Jacob Lyons in 1890, and then began to take over the shop from her mother. And on the right is a picture of some whortleberries, because they are famous for, children used to take time off school for the whortleberry season, which was picking them on Blagdon and Ham and so on. They're very low bushes and very nice for children because they're closer to the ground. But it's hard work picking them. And they used to take them into Sarah, and they'd be weighed and taken into Bristol by her husband Jacob, who was a carrier. And they'd be taken in a tin bath to be sold in the markets. She died in 1937, and the premises were let for a number of years, and then eventually sold to Arthur Lake in 1953. He ran the shop briefly, and his wife used to make ice cream and rock cakes and things, but she died, unfortunately. And in 1960, he sold Lantern Cottage and stayed in Rodgate around the corner. And the shirt factory was a big business in the village. Sarah was and her father before her, or grandfather before her, had been agents for the shirt factory. And they used to bring them to the village in packs of a dozen. And it was basically finishing the buttonholes and sleeves and collars. And those were the payments. And William Day up the road had a pony and trap, and he would deliver them around the village and collect them again. And you can see why these houses were used as, you know, in quotes, factories. They had big windows and you could see to sew. Whereas a lot of the cottages had very tiny windows. It would have been extremely difficult to sew buttonholes or anything else. Yeah. And it would have been a sociable thing to do, wouldn't it? You sort of joined with others and sat and sewed. And this is Jacob Lyons' garage. He started off as a carrier, a horse and trap going into the village. And then he went into motorised transport, charabancs, and then eventually into a garage. In 1925, he and Twist Lyons, his son, went down the road and built Mendip Garage, The last coach left the garage in 2011. And as you probably know, Michael reverted to horses. His main love was horses, and he's and now, of course, we've got the planning application active, haven't we, for building houses on the site, which is a very big site, actually, isn't it? So, coming towards the end, so probably one of the smallest ones, which is actually the easiest to trace, is the cottage, which is undergoing expansion at the moment, haven't they? They've knocked the little building down at the front. That was owned by the overseers of the poor, but we know that that's actually because Levi Derrick stayed in that cottage for a very long time, and then his daughter Harriet married William Day, and they were living there until 1940. Street End Cottage behind was occupied by William Dabb, two William Dabbs, actually father and son. They were both stonemasons. And if you can see that on the tide map, there was no land at all attached to 663, which is Street End Cottage. And Grace Dabb, the wife of one of the Williams, used that little piece of land bottom left, which was called Garden from Waste in the tide map, because you really did need a piece of ground to grow your potatoes and your greens and all the rest of it. I'm having trouble trying to find out who's living here, because I've got more families than there are homes, and it's very difficult to tell what was going on with Lantern Cottage, because this is the equivalent in 1921, and you can see how much all of those buildings have grown. With top, we've got Puzzle and Roddy Cottage, then we've got Lantern Cottage, which is enormous, and then Rodian Cottage behind, which has grown as well. You know, and it's very hard to tell whether they're two dwellings or one. If we had a few more deeds, it would help to clarify it. So now coming towards the end, the very smallest dwelling was that little two-storey building behind Alexandra Cottage, which was home to, remember her name now, Hurley, Elizabeth Hurley, poor woman. She lost her husband, and she was related, I think he must have been related to Jock Hurley, who had Orchard Cottage, but unfortunately she had to live in there with her three strapping sons. It's very small. It was one room upstairs and one room downstairs. And it's quite nice to see the difference in Alexander Cottage as well, isn't it? From its recent renovations, quite different. And the biggest change, we had to mention that, didn't we? So I went up to take a photograph, and I hadn't realised that Hugh's plaque is still on the wall there, the Dunbarring. I don't know whether people realise he moved from the Queen Adelaide, because he'd married the daughter of the licensee, and he moved from the Queen Adelaide when he came up here in 1964. He built the bungalow, and he called it Dunbarring because he'd finished bar work, and it's still on the wall. So, and then this is where I'm going to end. I think we ought to let Ikey Smarts have the last word. So. That's it. There we are. So I haven't covered every house. I'm sorry if you wanted to hear about yours. I might have it on here, but there just isn't time to go through everything. And if you do have any more deeds and documents that you'd like to share with us, we'd be very grateful to see them. Okay. So
thank you very much, Sheila. As ever. We've managed to pack so much in, and yet we all know that you know a whole lot more as well. So if you do know the area or any of those cottages and want a little bit more detail, then do ask Sheila, because she will definitely know. And she could have got, made a talk that was twice as long probably, but cutting it down like this is quite difficult to do, but to make it all relevant. So Thank you very much indeed. Really good. Is there anybody who's got a pressing question they'd like to ask on the floor? If not, talk to Sheila afterwards. And,
There are some maps on here to look at as well.
yeah, there's the big picture of the watches, so do come and have a look at that. We're quite cramped. Yeah, sorry,
I
John.
just would say it's not a question, but Sheila mentioned the fat factory, which the original fat factory was at the post office lane behind the butcher's shop right at the end, the bit of Laminate, which was, and then that was run by Johnny Upton and Arthur Ball.
Oh, yeah,
And
yes.
then the villagers got a little bit fed up with the smell and what have you. So they moved up to the fat factory that we all remember, or some of us remember. Not all of us.
Yeah.
This is Arthur Ball in the picture, and I think he went to Australia, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so and one of the members of his family, I don't know whether it's a son or grandson, has been in contact with Sheila and wanted to know all about the history and so on. So there's a link there. We're quite cramped, as you can see, but you're very, very welcome to have tea, coffee, biscuits. If you prefer to sit where you are, we'll bring it to you. Or if you can get up and help somebody else, then please do. But I think we should say once more, thank you very much to Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila.
See you back in November, I hope.
Anybody asking questions? What's that? Oh, who's that from?
Three.
Yeah, should I close it down?
Sheila, I'm
Yes.
going to say to you, I should have said it. My mother died. Well, I think it was 20. They rented it.
It only ever says street end.
It could have been.
Really?
I thought, well, I'll just wait and see if it comes up.
A lot of them were rented, especially in the 20s.
And they never, my dad never.
It's very difficult to put together because you don't know what to include and what to leave. See, I did concession training. It can just be too long.
It's very interesting.
Nice to see you.
Marianne's coming to say.
Did you get the tip? Did you email what Linda sent? Linda Cottage.
Hi Ben, it's gone very noisy in here. It's difficult to hear you. Everybody's chatting.
I know they are.
But only found out relatively recently that I never knew. Some of the important states told me all this, and that was
Because it says in our chat, but it says, isn't it, they had the outline planning, the long planning on both sides. I think it was like.
I don't know the exact.
I could see this thing coming in.
My memory was that my mum and Grace was there. It's a long story, basically.